Hi, in this video, I'm going to show you how to build, deploy, and then connect to an MCP server within Azure. I'm going to do this step by step. By the end of this video, we're going to arrive to a state that is represented by this architecture. Let's get started. In the initial setup, we're going to create an MCP server and then run it locally. We'll have an MCP client that connects to this MCP server and then uses the tools exposed by the MCP server. For this purpose, I've created a simple MCP server Python module in here, which makes use of the fast MCP class from the MCP Python SDK to create an MCP server. So if you look at this code, I've named this MCP server by passing in the environmental variable. So if you look at my environmental variable, MCP server name, I'm using the MCP demo local as a name for the MCP server. This is going to be run in a stateless HTTP mode, and it's going to be exposed on port 8086 with a streamable HTTP path of MCP. And for this MCP server, I've created two Python functions. One that takes two integers and then returns the result, and the other Python function that multiplies two integers and then returns the result. With Python SDK for MCP, all you need to do is add decorators like this to mark these Python functions as tools. Finally, I'm going to run this MCP server in a streamable HTTP transport mode. So this is one of the modes that's supported by the MCP. The other one is a standard IO transport mode, which is generally used for local deployments. All right, so let's run this Python MCP server. For this, I'll just run the Python module. So the MCP server is running in a streamable HTTP transport mode on port 8086. I've created another Python module called MCP client local. In this module, I've imported the streamable HTTP client from the MCP Python SDK. And then I'm going to connect to the MCP server, the local URL, so which is the 8086/MCP. I'm going to initialize the connection. And then I'm going to list the tools from this MCP server. And then I'm going to call the tools by passing in two hard-coded values, 5 and 5 for the addition tool, and then 5 and 5 for the multiplication tool. And I'm just logging the results as well. All right, so let's call this MCP client. So if you look at this, we made a HTTP request to the local MCP server. As you can see, right? So the MCP demo local is the name of the MCP server. We were able to successfully establish the connection. We're able to list the available tools from the MCP server. We are able to successfully call the tool, the addition tool. Look at the result. You see 10 as a result for the addition tool, and then 25 for the multiplication tool. Right. So basically, we were able to complete this setup. Let's extend this. Right. So in the next setup, we're going to package this MCP server, and then we're going to push it and then run it as a container within Azure App Service. And for the Azure App Service, we also configure an app registration that helps with authentication and authorization for the MCP server. And finally, we're going to make use of an MCP user security principle to connect to this MCP server. All right, so let's get started. So what I've done is for the same MCP server, I created a Docker file. As you can see, I'm passing in the MCP server name as the MCP server name used by the Python module. And then I'm installing 2 Python packages. And this MCP server is going to be run on port 8086, right? So let's go to the Azure portal. So within Azure, I've created a resource group, a new resource group, MCP demo resource group. For this step, right? So I'm referring to we need 2 resources. One is the Azure App Service, and the other one is the container registry. So within the Azure container registry, like I've already built the Docker image and I pushed it to the ACR service here, right? So as you can see, and then I go back to the Azure App Service. We go to the deployment center. I already connected to the ACR using the admin credentials, and then I'm going to, I've already pulled this Docker image and then running it as a container on Azure App Service. Okay. Also, I've created an app registration within Microsoft Entra ID called MCP Server App, and then I've configured it within the authentication settings for the Azure App Service. Okay, so I'm making use of the easy auth within Azure App Service, which simplifies your, the authentication and authorization setup within Azure App Service. Yeah. Basically, with this setup, the Azure App Service authenticates users and clients, validates the tokens, refreshes the tokens, all that is being taken by the Azure App Service. Okay, so let's go back to your Azure App Service. So as I said, already configured the app registration in here for the Azure App Service. One thing that we need to do for this setup is we need to add the token value, which is the same client ID of the MCP server app. I'll go into more details in a while. So I added this token, and the additional checks that are configured for this is allow requests only from this application itself, allow request from any identity, and then allow request only from this particular tenant. Okay, so if you go to the MCP server app, so this is the app registration. And then if you go to the enterprise app associated with this app registration, I've said yes for the assignment required, meaning if somebody wants to use the Azure, like the MCP, like somebody wants to connect to the MCP server running on an Azure App Service, the security principal needs to be assigned to the enterprise app. Okay. So what I've done is I've created an MCP user security principal within my default directory. And then I've added the MCP user as a user to this enterprise app. Okay. So basically we're using the same client to like the same app registration to, connect to the MCP server. Okay. So let's go back to the code, right? So I'll show this in little more details. So I created an MCP client remote. Okay. So within this MCP client remote, I'm going to use the same streamable HTTP client that I showed a while ago. I'm going to make use of the interactive browser credentials from Azure.identity package. Okay, so basically this is the client ID. So client ID is the one that we configured within Azure App Service. So this is the scope, right? So basically the user, so we're going to request for an access token for the MCP user configured in the enterprise app, right? So this is the default scope. And then this is the MCP server URL, which is the Azure App Service endpoint. Okay. Let's also print the token so it's clear. Okay, so let's run this. So basically, I'm using the interactive browser credentials to authenticate, and then I'm using the default scope to request for an access token. Then once I get to the access token, I'm going to pass it as a bearer token when I connect, when I make it, when I create the MCP client. Okay, so if you see, I'm passing the MCP server URL and the headers, which has the bearer token. Okay, and then I initialize this session, I list the tools, and then I make use of these tools, same as my previous example. Okay, so let's run this. Python MCP client remote. So I'm going to sign in as MCP user. Authentication complete. Let's go back to the code. Okay, so let's copy this access token right here. So basically, I'm going to make use of this access token. So this is the audience claim. And then, if you look at the client, it's the same. Okay, so I'm using the app ID. The app ID and the audience claim are the same, right? Because I'm using the same client in here, right? Um, so if you look at the logs, I was able to, so if you see the MCP demo remote, which is the MCP server name, the logs, you're able to connect to the MCP server and establish the connection, you're able to list the tools, and then you're able to use the addition and multiplication tool, right? Cool. So basically, we have completed this setup, right? So we have deployed the MCP server as a container on Azure App Service. We configured the Azure app, like the Microsoft Entra ID app registration, to make this as a protected resource. And then we assigned the MCP user to this enterprise app. The MCP user, so we requested an access token on behalf of the MCP user, and then we use the access token to call the MCP server, right? MCP server validated the access token, and then let us use the tools from the MCP server. Right. So let's go to the next step. So in the next step, we're going to create a new client for the MCP. Basically, we're going to create a new app registration, and then we're going to give this client access to call the MCP server on behalf of the user. Okay. So basically, I'm simulating the scenario wherein the user, which in this example is the MCP user, using a web application or a single page application, and then requesting an access token to connect to the MCP server. Okay, so this for this setup, right? So let's go to the Azure portal. Let's close this. So I've created a MCP client app registration already. Okay, so first of all, let's go back to the MCP server app registration, and then I've created a scope called access all. Okay, and we created this scope, and then within the MCP client app registration, go to the API permissions. I've added the MCP server. I've added this scope. Basically, we have given the delegated access type. So if you look at the type here, it's delegated. So the client app is given access to call the API on behalf of the user. Okay, I've already pre-configured and pre-approved the admin consent. So the user doesn't need to approve for these permissions. Okay. And also let's go back to the MCP client enterprise app. Look at the properties. I said assignment required, right? So any security principal who wants to use this client application needs to be added to the this enterprise app. Already added the MCP user as a user to this client app. Great. One thing that we need to do to make this setup work is add the token value, right? So since we're going to, like, web app is making a call to the API / the MCP server. Okay. So we need to add this allowed token audience. At the same time, we also need to change this, right? So currently it only allows requests from the application itself. Now we have created a new client app, right? So we need to add this client app as well. So let's go back, let's copy the client app application ID. Let's go to the authentication blade. Let's add the client ID, right? So currently it can accept request from the MCP server app and the MCP client app as well. Let's save it. All right, so let's go back to the code. Let's comment this out. So here we are going to use the MCP client app ID. So if you look at it, I've already added the client app ID. And then the scope, as you could, like you've seen the scope as well, right? So let's go to the MCP client app again. So this is the client ID. And then if you look at the API permissions, right? So this is the scope, right? And the MCP user already has access to the MCP server, right? So, but we're making use of the public client here, right? So, and then, we're going to request an access token using the interactive browser credential for authentication. And then, once the user is authenticated, we're going to request an access token, basically the delegated permissions in here, right? So once we get the access token, we're going to pass it as a bearer token when we connect to the MCP server from the MCP client here. Right. So let's save this and then let's run this. So it asks me for authentication. Basically, I'm using the authorization code grant with PKC in here. Like the OAuth 2.0. Okay, so it's running. So now I got the access token. So again, let's go back to this access token, right? So you look at this access token. So the calling app ID is the MCP client app by A43. And then, we are calling the API, right? So identifies the intended recipient of the token, right? So this is our MCP server app. Okay. So with this access token, we are able to connect to the MCP server on the Azure App Service, right? So this is the name of the server. We are able to list the tools, and then we are able to connect to the tools and then run it, right? So let's clear this. Let's go back to the architecture diagram. So basically, again, we have two app registrations created. One is for the MCP server, like the API, and then the other one is for the client. The client requests an access token for the MCP user, and then uses this user delegated access token to connect to the MCP server and then make use of the the tools from the MCP server. All right, so let's go to the next step. So in this step, we're going to add an Azure API management service in between the client and the server. Okay, so Azure APIM is going to validate the access token before sending the request to the MCP server. Okay, Azure API Management um, has the like, well, basically it's more like an API gateway that helps with several features such as security, traffic management, or protocol translation. Like for example, there is a new preview feature within Azure APIM for MCP servers, wherein you can add an existing API as an MCP server, and you don't need to convert your API to support the streamable HTTP transport mode. Azure APIM takes care of it. Yeah. Also, Azure APIM helps with observability. It also helps with governance and managing of your APIs or MCP servers. Yeah. Basically, like security, threat protection. Basically, you can integrate API security platforms with APIM. It helps with traffic management, um, protocol mediation, and maybe like as I said, right, so observability as well. Like if you can have like a high level monitoring of all of your APIs in one place. It also helps with response caching. Like Azure APM comes with default cache. You can also add an external cache like Redis, to the Azure APIM for caching your responses. And then it also helps with gateway aggregation, which I'm not going to go into more details here. All right, so let's go back to the Azure portal. Let's close this. So I've created an Azure API service already. I'm using a basic tier. Um, the MCP servers is a preview feature, and you could only see this feature if you opt in for the service updates. So you have to opt in for the AI Gateway early, update group. So that you can get the preview features for AI gateways, the MCP servers as well. Already did that. So here you can create and expose an existing MCP server, which is what we're going to use in this demo. But you can also expose an API, existing API that's registered within Azure APM as an MCP server as well. Okay, so let's click on expose an existing MCP server. Let's copy our URL. Okay, so this is our MCP server URL. Add it. It only supports the streamable HTTP transport type. That used to be like SSE in transport types as well. So it only supports the latest spec. Okay. Let's give a name to this path. Let's create this. Okay. So within Azure API, you can also configure policies. Basically, the rate limiting or the authentication, authorization, right? So these are all possible because of policies within Azure APIM. So you can also apply policies for the MCP servers. These policies cannot be applied at the individual tool level. This is at the MCP server level currently, right? So if you look at this MCP server, right? So the backend MCP server is the one that is running on Azure App Service, and then we have the MCP server URL, which uses the APIM endpoint, which uses the APIM URL. So you can configure policies. I already created policies for validating the access token. Let me copy and paste it here. So basically, I've added the validate Azure AD token policy. There's some properties like you need to provide a token, the tenant ID, the header name, which will have the access token, right? So it's the authorization header. If the validation is not, if the validation fails, it responds with a 401 HTTP error code with the error message. So this is my backend application ID. And I've also configured the list of client applications that can connect and the audience value, right? So we already seen the JWT tokens, right? So this is if the MCP user uses the same app registration of the MCP server, right? So and then this is when we have, you know, when the client app makes the calls to the MCP server, running on Azure App Service. Let's save it. Let's go back to code. So let's comment this out. Basically, everything remains the same for the client ID and scope, but instead of using the Azure App Service URL, now we are making use of the APIM, endpoint. Okay. Again, we're going to use the interactive browser credentials for authentication, and then we're going to request and access, token. Um, okay, and then we make use of the access token to connect to the MCP server, and then use the tools. So let's run this. Okay, give me 1 second. We have to save it. Let's run it. So we're going to sign in as an MCP user. You can see we're able to connect to the MCP demo, the remote server, but at this URL, right? And then, which is the API URL. We're able to list the tools, and then we're able to, make use of these tools, right? Let's go back to our design. So we're able to complete this setup, right? So we have used the Azure APIM features. Like Azure APIM validates the access token before passing the request to the Azure App Service. Okay, let's go to our final step, right? So Azure API Management integrates with Azure API Center, which helps with API discovery within the enterprise. So with Azure API Center, you can also connect to other services within in Azure to list all the APIs within enterprise. But it has a direct integration with Azure API Management. There is a preview feature for Azure API Center that supports the MCP server discovery as well. So basically, you can leverage the same service within the enterprise to find all the MCP servers within the enterprise. Okay, and then request access to the MCP server and then use it within your AI applications. Okay, so I created a free tier for API Center. So if you go to the Azure API Management, I've already created the Azure API Center. I created a free tier service here. So this may not have all the latest updates. Um, so what I did was I created the app registration for this API Center, and then I've also given the MCP user. I granted the built-in role, the Azure API Center data reader role to the MCP user. Look at it, right? So already like since it links with Azure API, right? So it can see all the MCP or the APIs from the Azure API here. And then if you go to the portal, let me sign in as the MCP user. So the user can see the APIs, the MCP server in here, right? Within API Center, you can configure a lot of metadata that helps with the discovery process. So other users can see what MCP servers are available, and the additional details associated with the MCP server, right? And may request access to the MCP server. Right. I think this is still in preview. And even the MCP server feature that is within Azure API, it's in preview. So do not use this in production yet. But yeah. All right. So in this video, right? So we come to the setup, right? So we have created a local MCP server. We're able to connect to it. Use tools from this MCP server. Then we package the MCP server, push to the Azure App Service, and we ran it as a container. We created an app registration associated with the Azure App Service, to make it more as a protected API/MCP. And then we gave the MCP user the ability to call the MCP server directly. And then we created another app registration for the MCP client. And the app would request for an access token on behalf of the user, the MCP user, in this example, and then makes use of the token to connect to the MCP server, right? And finally, we have added the Azure API service in between the client and the MCP server. And then Azure API Management validates the access token prior to sending the request to the backend, MCP server. And we also seen a simple, integration between Azure API Management and Azure API Center that helps with, the API and MCP server discovery. All right. Thanks for watching.